Good evening, viewers. In today's special session of the Geo interview, we have with us Professor Holly Buck. Professor Buck is an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. She has authored several books and research articles on themes ranging from global environment governance and environmental policy to public participation in emerging technologies for ensuring climate equity. Professor, it is an absolute pleasure for my part to have you with us today. I would like to extend a warm welcome to you from our team at the Geostrata.
Thanks. It's so great to be here.
To give our viewers a little premise on what we'll be talking about here, let's start with the topic that you authored your recent book on, which was After Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration, which came out in 2019. So, Professor, in your opinion, why has climate engineering gained so much traction in the recent times, and why is it seen as a viable solution to climate change?
Yeah, so I think it's gaining traction to some degree, not to super much, but people have been talking about it really since around 2009 when the Royal Society in the UK authored a big report about geoengineering our climate. And it hasn't really gone away because climate change is getting worse. We're seeing more climate impacts, and we're headed for an overshoot of the 1.5 degree temperature target. And people are seeing that decarbonization hasn't yet been happening at the speed that we need. And they're curious and concerned about what other things might help respond to climate change. Now, is it seen as a viable solution? I'm not sure. I think that the research is still really early. I think that there's two types of things that are called climate engineering. One is carbon dioxide removal, or approaches that would remove CO2 from the air and store it either in soils, in forests, or in rock formations underground in different places. That's becoming a viable solution to some degree. There's policy support for it. There's new companies that are trying to do it. But solar geoengineering is a very different approach. And solar geoengineering involves blocking some amount of incoming sunlight to cool the earth. So this is not an idea that actually acts on the root of the problem. It doesn't actually reduce carbon dioxide levels. But some people are looking at it, thinking about whether we should research it and how that research should be done.
So you talked about solar geoengineering, and it seems like this is something that would require a lot of capital from the side of private and government, both sides. So what amount of resources, both labor and capital, will be required for both small scale and large scale geoengineering? And is this environmentally sustainable?
Yeah, again, I think this is really different with carbon removal and with solar geoengineering. So with carbon removal, it will require a lot of labor, a lot of capital, because it involves things like changing how land management is done, changing how farming is done, building whole new industries in building machines that take CO2 out of the air, building up a new industry in biomass that can be combined with carbon capture and storage. It's really a huge effort. Solar geoengineering, on the other hand, would probably involve, if you were to do it by a method that used particles in the stratosphere, so putting particles in the upper layers of the atmosphere to reflect back sunlight, this concept would require a small fleet of specially designed aircraft that would be continually flying into the air to put these particles up. And these particles would stay lofted for a year or two, maybe, and come back to Earth. So this would be a continuous intervention for several decades or centuries. So that kind of project, it's similar to having a small airline industry. Basically, the cost would be in the billions, but it would be something that's manageable. The labor time is really that we need now is in the research to know if this would even be a good idea or if the negative impacts would outweigh the benefits. And so we really need a lot more people around the world just running computer model simulations, doing studies in the laboratory to better understand the concept.
course, and it I can't help it but to ask a follow-up question on this. We know that the amount of capital required in such an initiative would probably be a lot, and considering that the economies of a lot of our countries is unequal, considering the developing world and the developed world, do you think that we will be able to come to such an agreement in multilateral platforms such as COP or the UN, such that we can create this globally and we can consider this a solution for all of us rather than just some countries, that can actually lay out the capital as to establish something like solar engineering or geoengineering?
Yeah, so for carbon removal, I think that there's a lot of discussion about how the global north should be paying for this. Some countries have a commitment to be net negative rather than just net zero, which implies that they are moving more quickly with developing carbon removal systems, so they could actually be net negative. At the same time, if this is going to be a very big industry, you don't want other countries to be left out in the development of it. So I think what would be really nice to see here is more research partnerships that are international, so that there's expertise to build some of these carbon removal systems and even profit from them later in the century. I think that for solar geoengineering, again, it's the concerns with this aren't so much about the cost of it, because a few $1 billion compared to the impacts of climate change, it's not so
Yeah,
expensive. I think
of
the
course.
challenges there are really more about how can we collaborate in doing the research so that it answers the questions about the impacts that are relevant to people all around the world. How can we do the research so it's led by researchers in countries like India to study the impacts on Indian agriculture, for example? Um, I think it's great if nations in the global north can fund that research, but I don't think they should be exclusively producing it, because it's just
Yeah,
not an equal knowledge base.
of course. That takes me to my next question about how do you think can policy measures ensure that such technology does not lead to an unequal distribution of its benefits, and especially in the interest of the global south?
Yeah, for me, it really does begin with the knowledge base and making sure that the research is done in a collaborative, transparent way, so everybody can participate, everybody can have access to data sharing, and that can help make sure that some of the questions are answered. But then beyond that, we really do need a governance structure for this. We currently don't have formal governance of solar geoengineering. It's a big problem. There have been some attempts, for example, at the United Nations Environmental Assembly a few years ago. There was a proposition to fund an international assessment. We really do need an international assessment that all countries participate in looking at this body of evidence. Um, and I'm optimistic that that could happen, maybe in the next 10 years. I think that would help things. But even then, it still wouldn't be, governance of research is different than governance of deployment. And so many actors have called for a moratorium, so like an agreement not to actually do this deployment until there's more research and more thinking.
I think in the field of research, obviously there must be, a lot of challenges that you might be facing. So, what challenges does solar engineering and geoengineering research currently face? And if they can be solved, how can it be?
Yeah, so right now, the way solar geoengineering research proceeds is what we might consider an investigator-driven framework. And by that, I mean that if you are a scientist in a lab, in a university or some other organization, you have a question you want to study, you raise money from philanthropy or the private sector or a government to answer that question. And so the whole research is driven by what individuals are interested in. It's not looking comprehensively at all of the impacts that might happen. And so there's big gaps, for example, with thinking about the impacts on ecosystems. There's not a lot of ecologists who are interested in studying this idea because from an ecologist's point of view, these ecological systems are so complex that something that would modify the amount of sunlight coming to Earth just seems a little bit crazy. Then the situation is we don't really have good enough research yet on the ecosystem impacts. So I think that what we need is public funding from governments that studies all of the different things that could go wrong with this concept all around the world. We need international collaboration on this as well. And we need to also study the social dimensions, the impacts on human health, the impacts on human systems. And right now it's just very patchy. And I hope that we can work together to get public funding for this in the future.
Of course, I hope that does happen because research, I believe, is a very important area for such a big step to be taken and for it to have the least number of discrepancies that it could. Which also brings me to my next question. Apart from its potential to bring back pre-industrial levels of carbon, what are some aspects of climate change and geoengineering that geoengineering could not mitigate?
Yeah, so again, this is very different between the carbon removal and the solar geoengineering. So carbon removal could potentially bring back pre-industrial levels of CO2 in the atmosphere if we manage to fully decarbonize society and then get to this net negative. So, this would take a very long time, decades or centuries. It would require clean energy to power all of these systems, or would require different land management. But if we could, pursue this utopian dream of doing this, I think it could address a lot of the impacts of climate change eventually. Solar geoengineering, on the other hand, would not bring back pre-industrial levels of carbon. The rationale some people have suggested for it is that it will take so long to decarbonize, and we have only a few decades before we start to have more catastrophic impacts on ecosystems and human systems. So it's proposed more in terms of buying time to do that process of decarbonization and building carbon removal infrastructures. But I think the main thing for both of these is once you lose species, they don't come back. I think that for solar geoengineering, there's things like permafrost loss or ice sheet melt that maybe you can mitigate against some of these. There's ongoing research on this, but some of these impacts would not be very reversible. And obviously human life also that is lost from the climate disasters is not coming back. So neither of these is a silver bullet solution. Neither of them can be done without also decarbonizing. Because if one thing that's important for viewers to know is that with solar geoengineering, with this blocking the sun approach, if you were to begin doing that and then not work to decarbonize and develop carbon removal, you would be stuck doing this solar geoengineering indefinitely into the future. And if that program was interrupted for some reason, maybe a war, maybe some other political reason, the warming that was being suppressed over time would come really suddenly. And that would be much more catastrophic than the more gradual climate change path that we're on. So it's kind of like having a sword hanging over your head to do this and not also do the mitigation and the carbon removal.
Right, so that takes me to the end of this interview. And my last question to you is something that we ask most of our interviewees here. which is your advice for the youth? Because a lot of our viewers at the Geostrata are the youth, and they're not only from India, they're from EU, UK, US, and other places from all around the world. So, as a researcher and as an assistant professor in environmental policy and having written a lot of things, how is it like to be in the field that you are, and what advice professionally would you like to give to our youth, a lot of whom are aspiring professors or researchers?
I mean, I would just advise you to to get engaged. There's a lot of different ways to get engaged, both on the research and the government's side. There's some exciting new organizations that are working on this. One's called SRM Youth Watch. Another one is the uh, Alliance for the Just Deliberation of Solar Geoengineering. Both of those organizations, they don't have a position on whether to do this or not. They're really working on how can we engage with people in the global south, with the youth, to build their capacity for decision making. And so please check out their work. Check out also, if you're doing research, there's a fund called the Degrees Initiative that's funding researchers to do research on impacts in the global south. And they also have a new social science fund if you want to study the impacts of these concepts on society. So maybe also, if you see a gap, start your own organization to work on this, because there's a really big need for more voices to be engaged with this.
So I think we've established that more voices on this and more global collaboration on this is really important. So
Yeah.
until our viewers see this video, we thank you very much for having you here, for taking so much time out of your busy schedule. And we've loved talking to you. And I personally have loved interviewing you. And we wish that we could have you again sometime on another topic.
That would be great. Thank you so much for reaching out. It was a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much.